Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a topic that I think is going to resonate with just about anyone who's ever tried to learn something new. We're talking about that kind of intricate connection between, how our brains process information, we call that cognitive load, and how we kind of take the reins and manage our own learning, which is self-regulated learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a really solid source to guide us through this. A 2020 article from the Educational Psychology Review. It's titled Self-Management as a Bridge Between Cognitive Load and Self-Regulated Learning by Eitel, Andres, and Rinkel.
Sounds like a dense one.
It is.
So, for everyone listening along with us, what we really want to do today is give you a clearer picture of how you can actually learn more effectively by considering both how information is presented to you and that power you have to kind of steer your own learning journey. We want to get to the bottom of like why sometimes learning feels super smooth, other times it feels like, oof, you're just wading through mud, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it.
Exactly. And, the core idea that we'll be unpacking here is that self-management, that's that active process of taking control. It's like this crucial bridge. It connects the cognitive load that's imposed by, the material you're trying to learn and your own ability to kind of direct and control how that learning unfolds.
Love it. Bridge building. So, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's start with, I guess, the foundation of all of this cognitive load. Now, traditionally, how is cognitive load thought about in instructional design? How did educators approach it?
Well, the traditional view was pretty straightforward. The focus was on optimizing the instruction itself. Basically, educators would create these materials, and the goal was to make those materials as effective for learning as possible. You present the information well, and learning should follow. And within cognitive load theory, we typically talk about two main types of cognitive load. We've got intrinsic cognitive load. You
Yeah.
can think of that as like the inherent difficulty of the subject matter itself. Like, how complex is it? What prior knowledge do you, the learner, already have about the topic?
Okay, so like if I'm trying to learn about, I don't know, quantum physics for the first time, that's going to have a way higher intrinsic load than if I'm reading a simple news article about, I don't know, the latest weather forecast.
Exactly. And then on the other side, we have extraneous cognitive load. And this is the one we really want to try to minimize as much as possible.
Yeah, extraneous, that sounds like trouble.
It can be. Think of extraneous cognitive load as like the unnecessary mental effort that you have to expend because the learning materials are poorly designed. So things like, confusing layouts, irrelevant details, animations that don't actually explain anything, basically anything that doesn't actually help you understand the core concepts.
So intrinsic load is kind of like baked into the topic itself and my own knowledge, but extraneous load, that's something we can actually hopefully control through good design.
Exactly.
And these two, they kind of work together, right? It's not like one or the other.
Yeah, you're right. They're additive. So if you're already dealing with a topic that's intrinsically complex, you've got a high intrinsic load, you really want to work hard to reduce that extraneous load. Otherwise, your cognitive system, your brain can just get overloaded and learning suffers. Ideally, we want the big difference between the intrinsic and extraneous load so that your mental effort can be focused on actually understanding the material and building those meaningful connections. And we often call that germane cognitive load, the effort directed towards, deep understanding.
Germane. I like that. Germane cognitive load. So, I'm thinking back to some of my own classes. What are some like concrete things that instructional designers, teachers, anyone who's presenting information, what do they do to try and reduce this extraneous load? What can they do to make things easier to process?
Well, there's a bunch of research-backed principles out there. One really key one is avoiding what we call the redundancy effect, which is basically presenting the same information in, multiple ways like text and audio. If it doesn't actually add any new understanding, it's just redundant.
Right. Like if you're reading something and then the narrator is reading it to you verbatim, it's like, okay, I got it the first time.
Exactly. It's not helping. And then another really important principle is the contiguity effect. That means putting related bits of information close together, both in space and time. So, if you've got a text description and a diagram that illustrates it, you want to put those close together, right? So you're not constantly flipping between pages or scrolling up and down.
Ah, so that mental juggling act, I've definitely been there. You're trying to hold one piece of information in mind while looking for the other?
Exactly. And that wastes so much mental energy, right?
Yeah.
And that adds to that extraneous load.
Makes total sense. So, the traditional approach has been very much about the designer, the instructor, really trying to craft this perfect learning experience. But, This article we're looking at introduces this really intriguing idea that learners themselves play a massive role through something called self-management.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The authors really emphasize this concept called the self-management effect. And what that tells us is that the cognitive load you actually experience isn't just about the design of the instruction. It's also heavily influenced by how you, the learner, engage with the material, how you process it.
Okay, so even if the way something is taught isn't ideal, like maybe the design isn't perfect, a motivated learner can still find ways to kind of, I guess, compensate for that.
That's exactly it. Suboptimal instruction, suboptimal design doesn't automatically doom you to suboptimal learning. Learners can actively employ different strategies to counteract those, less effective elements.
So what would be like a real world example of that? How do you actually self-manage extraneous load when you bump into it?
Sure. Let's go back to that split attention thing we were talking about, the text and diagram being miles apart. A learner who understands that split attention is a problem, they might take a more active approach. If it's physical materials, they might physically bring the information together, like taking notes, drawing lines, connecting a specific part of the text to, the relevant part of the diagram. If it's a digital environment and the tools allow it, they might actually drag and drop elements closer together,
Right.
especially if they've learned that this technique works for them.
So it's not just passively absorbing the information, it's actively working with it, making it more mentally digestible.
Absolutely. And this self-management can even happen on a more, I guess, mental level. So let's say you, the learner, you're told beforehand what the purpose of different elements in the learning materials is. So for example, knowing which images are essential to understand a concept and which ones are just decorative, just there to look pretty.
Ah, yeah, I remember the article mentioned something about seductive details. What was that all about?
Right. Yeah. Idle and his colleagues did this really fascinating study back in 2019. They found that when students were learning with these, interesting but ultimately irrelevant seductive details sprinkled throughout the material, those students had higher extraneous cognitive load, and their learning actually suffered, unless they were told beforehand that those details weren't essential to actually achieve the learning goals. When they were told that, those seductive details, they no longer had that negative impact.
That's wild. So just knowing that something is irrelevant lets you mentally kind of tune it out?
Exactly. When you're informed about irrelevance, you can consciously choose not to, spend your mental energy deeply processing that information. You're basically taking control. You're self-regulating your own cognitive processing and filtering out that noise. And this, it links directly to the idea of self-regulated learners. These are individuals who take an active role in deciding what, when, and how they process information. They're not just passive recipients.
Okay, so this concept of self-management, it really puts the learner in the driver's seat, right? It's not just about passively absorbing information. And, the article makes the case that this self-management of cognitive load, it's like this essential bridge between instructional design and this broader idea of self-regulated learning.
That's one of the central points they're making, for sure. It's not just about coping with, less than ideal instruction. It's a fundamental part of being a self-regulated learner, someone who takes ownership of their learning. And, to kind of illustrate this connection, the authors bring in this framework called Effort Monitoring and Regulation, or EMR, developed by DeBruin and others.
Okay, EMR, break that down for us. How does cognitive load fit into this, bigger model of learning?
Well, the EMR framework places cognitive load right at the heart of the whole process. You can imagine it as being, positioned between the actual processing of information, that's what they call the object level, and your awareness and control over your own learning, the meta level, if you will. And at that meta level, you've got things like your learning goals and your assessment of, how well you're doing, how well you're progressing towards those goals.
So monitoring your progress, that's where you pick up on those little hints, those cues about whether things are clicking or if you need to switch gears, try a different approach.
Exactly. And often those cues come from the object level. Like maybe you realize you're having a hard time connecting different ideas in a text. Based on those cues, you then make decisions at the meta level about what to do, which control processes to put into action. So you might decide, okay, I need to go back and reread that section. Self-regulated learning, then, is this constant cycle of checking your understanding and using those insights to implement strategies that help you reach your learning goals.
Got it. So within this constant back and forth, where does this active self-management of cognitive load fit in? How does that work?
Well, the authors suggest that self-management acts as a control mechanism within this cycle. So, your meta level understanding things like knowing how to deal with, poorly structured text or recognizing irrelevant information that directly impacts how you process information at that object level, the level of the actual content. And that, of course, affects the cognitive load you experience. So, in a nutshell, by actively managing how you engage with the material, you're essentially managing your own cognitive load.
So I'm hearing this as like you have more control over your learning experience than you might think. It's not entirely in the hands of the instructor or the materials.
Exactly. But, this kind of active self-management, it does take a certain amount of, well, mental stamina, wouldn't you say?
For sure, you need the energy and the willpower to make it happen.
Right. And that's where self-control comes in. Self-control is that ability to align your actions with your goals, especially when you've got distractions or, more appealing alternatives tempting you. And the article actually talks about the work of Inslicht and Schmeichel, who proposed this model of what's called ego depletion. Basically, the idea is that our capacity for self-control, it's not limitless. It can get depleted kind of like a muscle after we've used it for a while.
So, like, if I've had a crazy busy day at work full of meetings and deadlines, and then I try to sit down and study later that night, am I going to be less equipped to ignore those distractions? Like my phone buzzing, a new show to watch?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. Your willingness to really put in the effort to manage your cognitive load, it might decrease as you study or after you've already done other mentally demanding things. Let's think about those seductive details again. At the beginning of your study session, you might be able to ignore them, no problem. But as your self-control resources get lower, you might find yourself more and more drawn to those interesting but irrelevant bits of information. And that, of course, increases your extraneous load and makes learning harder.
That makes so much sense. It's like sometimes I start studying and I'm super focused, but then as time goes on, my mind just starts to wander. It's like I can't resist those distractions anymore.
Right, and to really explore this in more depth, the article discusses a study by Bender and colleagues. They were looking at how students learned about atomic models, and they did this over 5 chapters, with some students getting materials that included seductive details and others getting materials without those details.
And what did they find? Did those tempting details always have a negative impact?
Actually, no. In the first chapter, the seductive details didn't seem to affect cognitive load or learning. But by the time the students got to the last chapter, those same seductive details led to higher extraneous load and worse learning performance.
So it's not just about the presence of those interesting but irrelevant bits. It's about when they're encountered during the learning process. That makes sense.
Exactly. The researchers thought that at first the learners could successfully manage their cognitive load. They could actively ignore those seductive details. But as they went through more and more chapters, that ability weakened, probably because their self-control resources were getting depleted. It's like that mental muscle was getting tired.
I can totally see that. And they also mentioned a connection to positive emotions in the study, right? Like how you're feeling while you're learning.
Yes, that's right. The study found that the negative effect of those seductive details in later chapters was linked to a decrease in positive effect. So it's not just about being less able to ignore those distractions. It's also about potentially feeling less good, less positive about the whole learning activity as you go along.
So it seems like well-designed learning materials, they're always a good thing, but they become even more important when the learner's self-control is lower, like towards the end of a long study session, or when they're feeling less positive about what they're doing.
Exactly. It's a nuanced issue. It's not that good design only matters at certain times. It's that the effective instructional design is influenced by the learner's self-control. When your self-control is strong, you can compensate better for materials that aren't ideally designed. But when your self-control is low, those design flaws can really become a problem. They can hurt your learning.
That makes a lot of sense. And the article also talked about how even before you start a specific learning task, like if you've already done something mentally demanding, that can impact your self-control right from the start. Like if I've already run a marathon, I'm probably not going to be in top shape for a sprint, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Doing mentally demanding tasks beforehand can definitely reduce your self-control even before you begin a new learning activity. And that might explain why sometimes we see big effects of good instructional design even with short learning times. The learner might already be starting off with lower self-control.
Wow, so much to think about. And what about the environment you're learning in? Like if you're at home versus in a library, does that play a role?
Definitely. The article talks about what they call opportunity costs or motivational costs. Basically, when you're trying to learn in an environment that's full of distractions like friends talking, your phone going off, it takes even more self-control to stay focused on your learning task. And this is especially true when you're learning on your own, like at home.
Oh, yeah, tell me about it. It's way harder to focus on a textbook when Netflix is just a click away.
Exactly. So in those environments, having well-designed learning materials can be even more important because the learner is already fighting against those distractions, those pulls on their attention and self-control. And, it's worth thinking of your own study space. Is your phone right there next to you? Are notifications constantly popping up on your computer? Minimizing those distractions can really help.
Yeah, creating that space for focus makes a huge difference. And I guess everyone is a bit different too, right? Some people just naturally enjoy putting in more mental effort, more of that self-management.
For sure. There's this idea of need for cognition, which is how much people enjoy and engage in effortful cognitive activities. Research suggests that people with a higher need for cognition might actually benefit more from strategies that involve more self-direction and effort, like deciding their own learning pace.
So if you enjoy solving puzzles and tackling challenging problems, you might be more willing to really dig into that self-management process.
Right. You're more willing to put in that mental energy. And, the article even points out that our ability to self-manage, it might actually get better with experience, at least with certain types of irrelevant information.
Oh, that's interesting. Like practice makes perfect, even for mental filtering.
Sort of. Some studies have found that with neutral, irrelevant information, as learners get more familiar with a task, they get better at filtering it out.
Hmm.
And that can actually lead to a weaker redundancy effect over time, which is interesting because it's different from what they found with those seductive details.
So it seems like the key difference is how interesting or attention-grabbing that irrelevant information is. Like it's way harder to consistently ignore something that's super engaging, even if you know it's not relevant.
Exactly. It's a lot easier to tune out something boring than something that's really grabbing your attention.
Okay, so to kind of sum all of this up, it seems like understanding how we learn best involves this really complex interplay between, cognitive factors like cognitive load and then these motivational and volitional factors like self-control.
Absolutely. It's not just about the information itself. It's about the learner, their motivation, their environment, their self-control. And it's really fascinating to see how newer theories of multimedia learning are starting to include these motivational and metacognitive aspects. It shows that our understanding of learning is becoming much more holistic.
Absolutely. So for everyone listening, what are the key takeaways from this deep dive? What should we all remember about cognitive load and self-regulated learning?
Well, the main things to remember are that cognitive load isn't just about the design of the learning materials. It's also hugely influenced by your ability to self-manage how you process information, and that relies heavily on self-control. But your self-control isn't constant. It can change depending on how long you've been studying, how tired you are, whether you've done mentally demanding things beforehand, and even how distracting the environment is.
So it's not just about the information itself, it's about you, the learner, and all of these other factors that are at play.
Right. And that means that optimizing cognitive load is a shared responsibility. It's about educators creating effective materials, but it's also about learners developing those self-management skills and being aware of those things that can affect their self-control.
That makes sense. So it's a two-way street, and I guess it's especially important to think about this when learners are new to self-regulated learning, or when they're feeling tired or overwhelmed, or when they're learning in a really distracting environment.
Yeah, that's when well-designed materials can really make a difference. They can provide that extra support when learners need it most.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It makes you think about how you learn and how you can take more control of that process. So for everyone listening, here's something to ponder. Think about those times when you were able to really focus and ignore distractions. What was different about those times? And how might the materials you're using, whether it's a textbook, a website, or a video, how might they be helping or hindering your learning, especially during those longer study sessions? It's definitely worth taking a moment to reflect on that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive,
Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.